Welcome to the Silent Empires, where silence holds its own kind of power, and every story leaves an echo long after it ends. This is a place for late hours, quiet minds, and stories told softly enough to pull you deeper with every word. No interruptions, no noise, just uninterrupted storytelling for those who understand that the strongest presence is often the quietest one. If this story drew you in tonight, take a moment to leave a like. And in the comments, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I like seeing how far these stories travel, and knowing who's awake, listening in the stillness with me tonight. The summer air over Brooklyn in 1981 hung heavy with heat and rumor. In back rooms and barrooms across the borough, men lowered their voices when certain names came up. The newspapers were full of stories about a federal agent who had infiltrated one of New York's most secretive criminal organizations for years, moving among its members as if he were born into their world. The old codes of silence and loyalty suddenly looked fragile. If an outsider could sit at their tables and listen, if he could watch as business was discussed and decisions were made, what else might the government know? And in the middle of that storm was a man whose name very few people outside law enforcement and the underworld had ever heard. Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano. He was not a boss, not a household name, but in that moment his choices, his loyalties, and his understanding of honor would cost him everything. To understand why, to understand how an ordinary boy from Brooklyn ended up at the center of one of the most famous undercover operations in American history, we have to go back to the beginning, back to a neighborhood where tight-knit families, economic struggle, and the shadow of organized crime shaped the lives of an entire generation. Dominick Napolitano was born on June 16, 1930, in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a place that was already a patchwork of immigrant communities and competing influences. The Williamsburg of his childhood was a world of narrow streets, tenement buildings, small storefront churches, and corner groceries run by families who had, in many cases, only recently arrived from Italy. For working-class Italian Americans in the early 20th century, the neighborhood was both a refuge and a trap. It offered familiarity, shared language, shared customs, shared food, but it also limited opportunity. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and discrimination against Italians, like other immigrant groups, was a documented reality in hearing and housing. In that environment, family ties and neighborhood allegiance meant everything. Public records and later law enforcement files identify Napolitano as the son of Italian-American parents, part of the broader wave of families who had left southern Italy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often fleeing poverty and instability. These families brought with them rural traditions of close-knit extended families and a reliance on personal relationships to navigate daily life. In Brooklyn, where landlords, employers, and sometimes the police could not be counted on to be fair, turning to someone who could get things done became part of a survival strategy for some residents. The year of Napolitano's birth placed his earliest memories against the backdrop of the Great Depression. By the time he was old enough to understand the world around him, unemployment lines and bread lines would have been a common sight in New York. Men stood outside factories and on street corners waiting for the chance at a day's work. Children in working-class neighborhoods like Williamsburg often left school early to help support their families, or they learned quickly that survival required ingenuity, sometimes in ways that brushed up against the law. While there is limited detailed documentation about Napolitano's specific childhood experiences, he grew up in a time and place where informal economies flourished. Numbers games, off-the-books labor, unlicensed vendors, and local fixers who mediated disputes or arranged favors. In Italian-American neighborhoods during these years, organized crime found fertile ground. It is crucial to emphasize that most Italian Americans had nothing to do with such activity and worked hard in legitimate jobs. Yet a small number of men connected to criminal organizations used the community's traditions of loyalty and discretion to build influence. They presented themselves not just as criminals, but as figures of authority who could make problems disappear, an arrest, a dispute with a landlord, a debt. For a boy growing up in this environment, these men were visible in a way judges, politicians, or distant business leaders were not. They were on the street corners, in the cafes, at the neighborhood social clubs. As Napolitano entered adolescence during World War II, Brooklyn's waterfront and factories became engines of the American war effort. The Brooklyn Navy Yard and nearby docks bustled with activity. The war created jobs, but it also intensified existing black markets, stolen goods, rationed items diverted from official distribution, and no questions asked loans for families trying to keep up with inflation and shifting fortunes. Organized crime figures took advantage of these conditions where they could, but for teenagers like Dominick, the war years also meant exposure to new models of masculinity and authority. Older brothers, cousins, and neighbors went off to fight. Some did not return. Others came back changed, less inclined to accept low-paying, insecure work. Records about Napolitano's schooling are sparse, but like many working-class children of his generation, it is likely that formal education competed with family responsibilities and the pull of the streets. Police and court documents from later decades place him firmly in the orbit of the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's 5 major Italian-American criminal organizations, and those relationships generally began early, through neighborhood contacts and social networks. In Williamsburg, Bonanno influence was particularly strong. Local bars, cafes, and private clubs functioned as meeting spots where lines between legitimate socializing and criminal plotting could blur. Along the busier avenues, legitimate businesses, tailors, bakeries, groceries, stood next to storefronts that served as informal headquarters for men associated with the local family. Young men who showed reliability, discretion, and a willingness to follow instructions could find small roles, running errands, keeping an eye on who came and went, carrying messages. These roles did not always look like crime in the overt sense. They might involve watching parked cars, delivering envelopes, or sitting in a cafe and nodding who talked to whom. For someone like Napolitano, these early responsibilities would have taught him who held real power in the neighborhood, and how that power moved quietly, often invisible to outsiders. By the late 1940s, the world Dominick grew up in was changing. The war was over, soldiers were returning home, and the American economy was shifting into a new phase of prosperity. For many families, this meant opportunities to move out of crowded tenements into better housing in Brooklyn, Queens, or even the suburbs. But that story of upward mobility was uneven. In tightly packed sections of Williamsburg, poverty and limited opportunity persisted. Urban renewal policies would, in later decades, reshape the neighborhood, but in the immediate post-war years, much of the old social structure remained. In these years, law enforcement attention toward organized crime intensified. Federal and local officials were becoming more aware of the national scale of criminal organizations, even if they did not yet fully grasp their structure. Hearings, investigations, and newspaper exposés began to pull back the curtain on the world that men like Napolitano were entering. Names of bosses occasionally appeared in print. Stories about illegal gambling, loan sharking, and bribery circulated. Yet the day-to-day operations of local crews remained largely hidden, protected by a culture of fear and silence. For communities that distrusted authority, cooperating with police was still seen by many as dangerous or dishonorable. By his late teens and early 20s, Napolitano's name begins to appear in law enforcement intelligence as a young man connected to known figures in the Bonanno family. These references are typically brief, noting his presence at certain social clubs or his association with established members. They suggest that by the early 1950s, he had moved beyond the margins of that world and into a more formal role, though exact dates of when he became an associate in the organizational sense are not precisely documented in public records. What is clear is that he was seen by those above him as dependable, calm under pressure, and observant, traits that, in that environment, could be as valuable as physical strength. The post-war years also brought shifts within the Italian-American community that shaped how someone like Napolitano viewed his options. On the one hand, there were increasing examples of success through education and legitimate business. Second-generation Italian-Americans were becoming lawyers, teachers, and civil servants at higher rates than before. On the other hand, entry into many professions still involved barriers, informal quotas, discrimination, or simply a lack of connections. In contrast, the criminal network offered a different kind of advancement, based on personal loyalty and demonstrated usefulness rather than formal credentials. This did not make it an easy life. Violence, imprisonment, and betrayal were constant threats. But to some young men in neighborhoods like Williamsburg, it appeared to be a path where their background was not a hindrance, but an asset. As Napolitano's involvement deepened, his world centered increasingly on the social clubs and bars that functioned as unofficial offices for the Banana organization. These places were carefully chosen, modest from the outside, often indistinguishable from 100 other neighborhood establishments. Inside, however, they provided a controlled environment where introductions could be made, disputes settled, and orders passed down. One of the central skills for anyone in that setting was the ability to read a room, who deferred to whom, who spoke freely, who kept to themselves. Later accounts by undercover agents and informants describe Napolitano as a man who paid close attention, who listened more than he spoke, and who had a reputation for taking his responsibilities seriously. At the same time, the broader image of organized crime in America was being reshaped by national events. The 1957 Appalachian Meeting, a gathering of major crime figures from across the country that was famously raided by New York State troopers, confirmed publicly what many had long suspected, that organized crime was not just a collection of local gangs, but a coordinated network with national reach. Congressional hearings and media coverage following the raid focused public attention on the mafia, a term that had been used inconsistently, but now became part of everyday language. Within the Italian-American community, this dual visibility produced tension. Many community leaders denounced the criminal minority for reinforcing negative stereotypes, while others, whether out of fear or profit, maintained accommodations with them. For a man like Napolitano, operating at the neighborhood level, these larger events filtered down in practical ways. Increased law enforcement scrutiny meant more caution, conversations held at lower volume, fewer written records, more use of intermediaries. It also meant that trust became even more valuable. To be included in certain conversations or tasks signaled that the older men believed in one's reliability. Over time, this trust often translated into increased responsibility in activities such as overseeing gambling operations, collecting debts, or managing the day-to-day affairs of a small crew. By the early 1960s, law enforcement sources and later memoirs by undercover agents and associates would describe Napolitano as firmly embedded in this mid-level stratum, a man who was not yet a major decision-maker, but who had clearly moved beyond the status of a peripheral errand runner. The social world around him remained defined by strict boundaries, both internal and external. Internally, the organization enforced a code that prioritized loyalty, secrecy, and obedience to higher-ranking members. Externally, there were invisible lines between those inside the criminal network and the broader Italian-American community. These lines were not absolute. Many men involved in organized crime maintained close family ties with relatives who had nothing to do with that life, but they were real. One did not discuss certain matters at family dinners or in public spaces where outsiders might overhear. Children might know that an uncle or cousin had connections, but direct explanations were often avoided. In this environment, ideas about honor, masculinity, and responsibility were filtered through a particular lens. Standing up for oneself, not cooperating with law enforcement, helping a friend in trouble. These were all valued traits in the community at large. Within the criminal world, they were codified into a stricter set of expectations, enforced not just by social pressure, but by the threat of serious consequences for those seen as disloyal. Over time, these expectations could become deeply internalized. When later accounts describe Napolitano as a man who placed great emphasis on loyalty and keeping one's word, they are reflecting not only his personal character, but the cultural norms of the environment in which he had come of age. At the same time, it is important to recognize that this path was not inevitable. Many young men in Williamsburg at the same time, from similar backgrounds, chose very different lives. Some joined unions and became longshoremen or construction workers. Others opened small businesses or pursued higher education. The choice to become deeply involved with a criminal organization, even if it felt gradual and shaped by circumstance, represented a series of decisions. Those decisions would have consequences not only for Napolitano himself, but for the families and communities whose lives intersected with his. By the time the 1960s began in earnest, Dominick Napolitano was no longer simply a boy from a struggling immigrant neighborhood. He was a known quantity within one of New York's most entrenched criminal organizations, operating in a city that was undergoing dramatic change. New highways cut through old neighborhoods. Manufacturing jobs began to decline. New waves of immigrants and migrants were reshaping the city's demographics. In this shifting landscape, the old world of the neighborhood social club and the unwritten codes of conduct remained, but they were increasingly out of step with the broader currents of American life. For Napolitano, however, those old loyalties and structures were the world he understood best. They would guide his next steps, steps that would lead him deeper into responsibility, deeper into conflict with the law, and eventually into the path of a determined undercover agent who was quietly taking notes on everything he saw. As the 1960s unfolded, the New York underworld was unsteady but far from collapsing. Publicly, politicians talked tough about cracking down on organized crime. Newspapers splashed photos of handcuffed bosses across their front pages. Behind closed doors, however, the structure of the city's major crime families remained intact. They adapted, shifted, and learned to live with the new scrutiny. In that world, men like Dominick Napolitano moved from the shadows of neighborhood errands into roles that carried real influence, even if most New Yorkers still had no idea who they were. By this time, Napolitano was no longer just a young man hanging around the social clubs of Williamsburg. Law enforcement surveillance reports from the early 1960s list him among the regulars at certain Bonanno-controlled locations in Brooklyn. Those reports, though often fragmentary, show a pattern: repeated sightings at known meeting spots, interaction with recognized members, presence at gatherings where the same names surfaced again and again. To the FBI and the New York Police Department, he was increasingly labeled not merely as a local tough, but as a reputed associate of the Bonanno family. The path from associate to full member, the status often referred to as being made, was deliberately obscure by design. The precise year of Napolitano's formal induction is not documented in public records, and those inside that world rarely spoke about such moments on the record. What can be reconstructed from later testimony and the accounts of undercover agents is that by the late 1960s, he was generally regarded inside law enforcement as a soldier in the Bonanno organization. That status implied that he had been vetted and approved by higher-ranking figures, his Italian heritage confirmed, his loyalty tested in ways that outsiders seldom saw. Membership came with expectations and obligations. Soldiers were expected to earn money for their superiors through a variety of illicit activities, primarily illegal gambling, high-interest loans to desperate borrowers, and control of certain union or business arrangements where money could be skimmed from the top. These schemes did not always look spectacular, and they rarely drew headlines compared to more dramatic crimes, but they brought in steady income. For the people on the receiving end, the effects could be devastating. Families losing savings at rigged card games, small business owners trapped in cycles of debt to loan sharks, workers pressured into silence as corrupt officials siphoned off benefits. In Brooklyn's Italian-American neighborhoods, this combination of intimidation and patronage created a complex reality. Some residents resented and feared the men who controlled local gambling or who made unannounced visits to collect tribute from businesses. Others, facing a tangle of bureaucracy and discrimination, saw those same men as problem solvers, the people who could arrange a job, smooth over a dispute, or help with a legal problem, all without paperwork or waiting rooms. For someone like Dominick Napolitano, operating in the middle of this system, maintaining that balance of fear and apparent usefulness was part of the craft. As his responsibilities grew, so did his visibility to law enforcement. Arrest logs and investigative files from the 1960s show that his name surfaced periodically in connection with gambling and related offenses. These were not spectacular cases. They were the kinds of arrests that came from raids on backroom card games or surveillance sweeps of known gathering places. In some instances, charges were reduced or dismissed. In others, they resulted in brief stints in custody. What mattered inside his world was not so much the legal outcome as his behavior under pressure. A man who kept silent, accepted the consequences, and did not bring unwanted attention to his superiors could see his standing rise. This was also the decade of one of the most turbulent periods in the Bonanno family's history. In 1964, the long-serving boss Joseph Bonanno became embroiled in a power struggle that erupted into what journalists later dubbed the Bonanno War. Bonanno allegedly plotted to eliminate rival bosses. In turn, he himself was targeted. His sudden disappearance, widely believed by law enforcement to have been a kidnapping engineered by his enemies, created a leadership vacuum. Factions within the Bonanno family aligned themselves with different contenders. Street-level soldiers and associates, including men of Napolitano's generation, had to navigate a climate where a careless word or the wrong association could be fatal. There is no evidence that Napolitano played a deciding role in the high-level maneuvering of this conflict. He was still a relatively junior figure, but he lived through it, and the lessons were clear. Loyalty mattered, but it had to be placed carefully. Survival meant paying close attention to shifting alliances, reading subtle cues about who was rising and who was falling, and avoiding unnecessary exposure when powerful men were at odds. In this sense, the internal Bonanno struggle became a training ground. Those who endured the chaos emerged with a sharper sense of how fragile authority could be, and how quickly fortune could change. By the late 1960s, Joseph Bonanno had been sidelined and eventually retired from active leadership. A new order, backed by the broader governing body known as the Commission, began to take shape. For the Bonanno family, long seen as one of the more traditional and tightly knit of New York's crime organizations, this transition was profound. Established hierarchies were disrupted, and room appeared for ambitious mid-level figures to move up. Men who had proven themselves reliable, who maintained discipline within their crews, and who did not draw reckless attention became valuable assets. Over time, Napolitano would become one of those men. The 1970s opened on a New York that felt both familiar and frayed. Manufacturing jobs were declining, the city's finances were crumbling toward near bankruptcy, and crime of all kinds was rising in many neighborhoods. For organized crime groups, this environment was both a challenge and an opportunity. Economic desperation meant more people willing to borrow from high-interest lenders or to seek quick money through gambling. At the same time, law enforcement was investing in new tools, wiretaps, long-term investigations, interagency task forces that made old ways of doing business riskier. Within the Bonanno family, leadership passed to Philip Rasselli, a man favored by the Commission. Officially recognized as boss in the mid-1970s, Raselli spent much of his reign dealing with legal troubles and extended periods in prison. That absence left day-to-day power in the hands of senior capos and a handful of ambitious underlings. Among these was Carmine Lilo Galante, an older, feared figure who sought to dominate the family regardless of Raselli's formal title. The tension between Raselli loyalists and Galante's followers added another layer of internal danger. Napolitano was part of the Raselli camp, aligned with younger figures such as Joseph Massino, who saw their future tied to the commission-approved boss rather than to Galante's independent ambitions. In these years, Napolitano's stature grew. By the mid-1970s, federal and local law enforcement files increasingly referred to him not simply as a soldier, but as a captain, a capo, responsible for his own crew of men within the Bonanno structure. This role placed him a step below the family's top leadership, but firmly within the inner workings of its criminal operations. The center of his world in this period was a modest establishment in Williamsburg, the Motion Lounge, a neighborhood bar that served ordinary customers while doubling as a de facto headquarters for his crew. To passersby, it looked like countless other Brooklyn taverns, a place for locals to have a drink, watch a game, or talk after work. Behind that ordinary facade, however, it functioned as an office. Associates checked in to report on earnings from gambling or loans. Envoys from other crews stopped by to coordinate joint ventures or relay messages. Conversations shifted quickly if an unknown face appeared at the door. Descriptions from later FBI reports and undercover accounts paint a consistent picture of Napolitano during these years. He was of average height and build, often neatly dressed, sometimes wearing dark-tinted glasses. He cultivated a calm demeanor, preferring to listen while others spoke. When he did give instructions, he tended to be direct rather than theatrical. Those who dealt with him regularly described a man who valued punctuality, discretion, and follow-through. In an underworld that included its share of braggarts and hotheads, this self-control stood out. Outside the bar and the business meetings, there was another side to his life that neighbors saw more clearly. He owned a home in Brooklyn, a solid, unremarkable row house like many others on the block. On its roof and in the yard, he kept pigeons, a traditional hobby among many working-class New Yorkers, but one that in his case also carried echoes of an older Italian culture. Caring for the birds required patience and routine. On quiet days, he could be spotted tending to them, a man who, to anyone not versed in the underworld, might have seemed simply like a somewhat private, middle-aged neighbor. The contrast between the ordinary and the illicit was a defining feature of his existence. To relatives and longtime neighbors who were not involved in organized crime, he could present as a provider, someone who had done well, without inviting too many questions about the details. Within the Bonanno family, however, his reputation depended on something entirely different: his ability to generate money, maintain order among his subordinates, and enforce the organization's rules when necessary. Those rules included the expectation that disputes would be handled internally, that debts would be collected, and that anyone suspected of cooperating with law enforcement would be treated as an existential threat. Among the men who reported to him, one figure in particular would become closely intertwined with his story: Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero, a talkative, street-hardened soldier whose life and finances were deeply entangled with both gambling and loan sharking. Ruggiero, older than many of the up-and-coming men, had a reputation for both loyalty and volatility. Napolitano's ability to manage and use such a man effectively was a sign of his standing. He did not need to posture. His authority over Ruggiero and others was taken for granted within their circle. During these same years, the Bonanno family's internal struggles came to a head. Carmine Galante, operating from a position of raw intimidation and long-standing criminal connections, attempted to seize effective control of the family, sidelining Raselli's loyalists. His brutal methods and disregard for the collaborative structure of the commission alarmed other New York families. In 1979, Galante was killed in a carefully coordinated attack at a Brooklyn restaurant, an event widely understood by law enforcement and underworld observers as the result of a decision by multiple families, including the Rosselli camp within the Bananos, to end his challenge. For Napolitano and others aligned with Rosselli, Galante's death cleared the path for a new generation of leadership. In the reorganization that followed, men like Joseph Massino and Dominick Napolitano solidified their roles as key power brokers. With Rosselli often behind bars, they effectively managed large parts of the family's day-to-day affairs, overseeing rackets, resolving disputes, and representing Bonanno interests in dealings with other families. For law enforcement, their names began to appear with increasing frequency in intelligence assessments of who really controlled the Bonanno operations at street level. In practical terms, this meant that Napolitano's reach extended beyond Williamsburg. His crew had interests in various illegal enterprises, card games and dice games held in back rooms, sports betting operations that took wagers on everything from boxing matches to baseball, high-interest loans to gamblers and small business owners who had run out of legitimate options. Some of these operations were based in New York, others connected to ventures in Florida, where New York families had long maintained a presence in certain cities, especially around lucrative seasonal tourist economies. Each of these activities existed in a gray zone of public awareness. Regular patrons might have suspected that the back room of a neighborhood bar hosted more than just friendly poker, or that the man offering quick cash for emergencies was tied to people who should not be crossed. But without obvious violence on the sidewalk, many residents learned to look away. For the people caught in debt or addiction, however, the reality was stark. Interest rates on illegal loans were punishing. Those who could not pay faced escalating pressure, visits, threats to property or employment, or the loss of whatever collateral they had put up. Even when such confrontations did not turn physically violent, the atmosphere of fear and control took a serious toll. Law enforcement, increasingly determined to dismantle these systems, shifted toward longer-term strategies. Instead of relying only on raids and street arrests, the FBI and New York authorities began investing in sustained surveillance and the use of undercover operatives. After the Appalachian meeting and the public embarrassment of earlier failures to recognize the scale of organized crime, federal agencies were under pressure to demonstrate that they could penetrate even the most insular families. The Bonanno organization, shaken by its internal conflicts but still functioning, became a prime target. Its neighborhoods were familiar to investigators, who had watched certain social clubs and bars for years. Its leadership transitions created points of vulnerability. Any change at the top brought new players into semi-public view. Within this context, a decision was made inside the FBI to attempt something that had rarely been tried on such a scale: embedding an undercover agent not just on the fringes of mob operations, but directly into the trusted circles of a major family. That plan would eventually bring a man using the name Donnie Brasco, a supposed jewel thief from Florida, into the orbit of Benjamin Ruggiero, and through Ruggiero, into the world of Dominick Napolitano. When Donnie first began appearing at the Motion Lounge in the mid-1970s, drifting into conversations, buying drinks, and sharing stories of supposed exploits in the stolen goods trade, there was nothing outwardly remarkable to distinguish him from the many small-time operators who passed through such places. For Napolitano, who had spent decades assessing the reliability of potential associates, he was simply one more face to be evaluated. What drew Napolitano's attention over time was not bravado or showmanship, but the qualities that he most valued in his own men: apparent steadiness, a willingness to follow instructions, and an ability to earn money in ways that fit the crew's needs. As Donnie spent more time around Ruggiero, quietly demonstrating his supposed skills and observing the unspoken rules of the environment, Napolitano began to treat him less as an outsider and more as a potential asset. The codes of loyalty and trust that had shaped his life from Williamsburg childhood to Underworld captaincy would now be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. As the lines between friend and foe, between family and infiltrator, were blurred by an operation conducted with patience and care by the very authorities he had spent his career learning to evade. By the end of the 1970s, Dominick Napolitano was as firmly entrenched in the Banana organization as he would ever be. He had weathered the family's internal wars, survived leadership changes, and emerged as a trusted captain with his own crew and his own territory. From the outside, very little about his daily movements seemed extraordinary. He rose in the morning, tended to his pigeons on a Brooklyn rooftop, checked in at the Motion Lounge or other neighborhood haunts, met with associates, and returned home late. Yet in those same years, a quiet, methodical effort was unfolding around him, an undercover operation that would eventually make his name known far beyond Williamsburg, and that would probe directly into his understanding of loyalty, trust, and survival. The man who would come to be known in Napolitano's world as Donnie Brasco had in fact begun his undercover work years earlier, slowly feeling his way into the lower levels of New York's criminal economy. Under his assumed identity, he frequented bars and clubs where small-time thieves and fences gathered. He talked about jewelry, about stolen merchandise, about the kinds of crimes that did not immediately raise suspicions of law enforcement interest. Over time, he built a reputation as a competent operator, someone who could move valuable items, who always seemed to appear when a deal was possible, and who, crucially, never talked too much about himself. It was through these circles that he met Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero, one of the seasoned soldiers under Napolitano's influence. Ruggiero, with his blend of street experience and financial desperation, found in Donnie a useful partner. The agent listened, showed deference, and reliably produced a share of money from jewel deals and other schemes. As their partnership deepened, Ruggiero began bringing him around the places where he spent most of his time, the Motion Lounge and other banana-linked haunts in Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. There, Donnie would be introduced simply as a friend from the street, a guy who knew how to make a score. In the beginning, Napolitano's interest in the newcomer was cautious and professional. As a capo responsible for a crew, he had seen countless hopefuls come and go, men who exaggerated their connections, boasted about their toughness, or tried too hard to impress. The ones who lasted were usually quieter. From FBI reports and from the undercover agent's later account, a picture emerges of the early encounters. Napolitano observing quietly from a corner table, weighing this supposed jewel thief against his own long-cultivated instincts. Gradually, the reserved man with the thick dark hair and the measured manner, Sonny Black to his peers, began to engage more directly. He called Donnie over, asked him about deals, tested his stories for consistency. He watched how the newcomer handled small tasks, delivering a package, passing a message, showing up on time. In this world, small tasks were rarely small in meaning. The ability to follow instructions without drama, to keep one's temper, and to accept correction without visible resentment were all markers of someone who might be trusted with more. Trust, in Napolitano's view, was not a sentimental concept. It was a working tool built out of repeated experience. If a man said he would be somewhere, he had to be there. If he promised to bring in money, the money had to appear. If questioned by police, he had to keep quiet. Over months and then years, Donnie did all of these things, always within the carefully controlled parameters set by his handlers in the FBI. The operation depended on him appearing entirely committed to the life he was entering, and by the late 1970s, that appearance had become deeply convincing to those around him. Inside the Motion Lounge and other meeting spots, Napolitano began to share with him the unwritten rules of the banana world. According to the undercover agent's later testimony and memoirs, Napolitano explained how a man was supposed to conduct himself, which social clubs required a call before entering, how to greet higher-ranking members, when to speak, and when to stay silent. He stressed the seriousness of obligations. Owing money was not simply a matter of dollars. It was a matter of respect. Bringing strangers around without permission, raising one's voice to a superior, or discussing internal affairs with outsiders were all lines that could not be crossed. In these conversations, Napolitano did not present himself as a swaggering outlaw. Instead, he spoke in the language of order and discipline. To him, the Banana Organization was not just a collection of criminals, but a structured society with its own hierarchy and expectations. He emphasized that once a man was, with someone, formally placed under the wing of a particular captain, his primary loyalty within that world was clear. Decisions were not to be made independently when they touched on money, territory, or violence. They flowed up the chain of command. As Donnie grew closer to Ruggiero, and by extension to Napolitano, he was increasingly drawn into the crew's illegal enterprises. He helped with gambling operations, delivering messages, coordinating with bookmakers, assisting in the collection of bets. He played a role in sorting out disputes over loans and debts. These activities, observed and recorded where possible by law enforcement, provided prosecutors with a clearer understanding of how money moved through the Banana network and who benefited. One of the most consequential steps came when Napolitano decided to extend his crew's reach more aggressively into Florida. For decades, New York-based crime families had viewed certain Florida cities as attractive territory, warm-weather tourist hubs where seasonal crowds could be enticed into card games, sports betting, and high-interest borrowing. Florida also had its own local crime figures and families, and any New York group seeking to operate there had to navigate both local law enforcement and underworld politics. Around the late 1970s, Napolitano and his allies saw an opening. A fellow Banana associate had struggled to make a Florida venture profitable. Tensions and unpaid debts created an opportunity for a change in management. Napolitano sent Ruggiero and Donnie south to take over, backing them with his authority from Brooklyn. The plan was straightforward in concept. Establish a foothold in a nightclub and related ventures, open channels for illegal gambling and loans, and report profits back to the crew in New York. From a law enforcement perspective, this expansion was a significant development. It demonstrated not only the Banana family's interest in multi-state rackets, but also the level of trust Napolitano now placed in the undercover agent. Donnie was no longer just a local earner. He was representing Napolitano's interests hundreds of miles away, making decisions on his behalf and invoking his name in negotiations and disputes. The FBI, monitoring communications and gathering reports, saw in this a rare window into how a New York capo delegated authority and managed distant operations. On the ground in Florida, the realities of running illicit businesses were complicated. Ruggiero and Donnie had to deal with local competitors and with owners and managers of legitimate establishments who were wary of getting entangled. They also had to be careful not to antagonize established interests linked to other crime families, including those based in Florida itself. Napolitano, back in Brooklyn, kept in contact, offering guidance and adjusting strategy as information came in. He wanted profits, but he also wanted to avoid a public conflict that might draw unwanted attention from both local authorities and rival organizations. The Florida venture, while never as lucrative as some had hoped, served another purpose for Napolitano. It tightened the personal ties between him and Donnie. Running operations together, even across distance, created a shared sense of enterprise. According to later accounts, Napolitano began to talk about Donnie in familial terms, referring to him as if he were almost an adopted son within the crew. In one gesture frequently cited in discussions of the case, He provided the agent with keys to one of his residences, an act that symbolized a high level of personal trust in a world where privacy and security were paramount. While these relationships deepened, federal investigators were steadily building a case. They had spent years listening, watching, and preserving every scrap of information the undercover operation could safely provide. In some instances, they were able to install hidden microphones in locations associated with Napolitano, capturing conversations about business, alliances, and fears. These recordings, though limited and often coded in language, helped confirm what agents suspected about the hierarchy of the Bonanno family and the roles played by men like Napolitano. At the same time, the Bonanno organization was once again edging toward internal conflict. The long imprisonment of official boss Philip Raselli had created space for rival centers of power, while Raselli's loyalists, among them Napolitano and Joseph Massino, maintained significant influence. Other captains were dissatisfied with their share of authority and profits. The most prominent of these dissenters included Alphonse, Sonny Red, Indelicato, Philip Giacone, and Dominick Napolitano, powerful figures in their own right who believed they could steer the family in a different direction. Whispers of a potential split circulated quietly through the clubs and cafes. For someone in Napolitano's position, these were dangerous currents to navigate. He and his allies understood that if the insurgent captains succeeded in displacing Raselli's camp, their own power, and quite possibly their lives, would be at risk. Conversely, moving too openly against fellow captains could trigger a cycle of retaliation that might tear the family apart. It was in this tense atmosphere that Donny heard fragments of conversations about loyalties, possible confrontations, and the need to straighten things out before matters got out of hand. The undercover agent, bound by the limits of his cover, could not always probe directly, but he was present enough to sense that a serious confrontation was brewing. Napolitano, increasingly frank with him about internal issues, spoke of our side and the other side, of the need to stand firm behind Raselli's authority even while the boss remained in federal custody. He emphasized that decisions at this level were not taken lightly, that once certain lines were crossed there would be no going back. Meanwhile, the FBI's case files on Napolitano himself were thickening. His name appeared on wiretap transcripts, on surveillance logs detailing meetings with other known crime figures, and on reports related to gambling and loan sharking in both New York and Florida. Federal prosecutors, using the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act (RICO), were increasingly focused on assembling cases that portrayed such men not as isolated offenders, but as participants in an ongoing criminal enterprise. This approach allowed them to connect seemingly separate acts, a gambling operation here, a fraudulent business deal there, into a single pattern of racketeering activity. By 1980, law enforcement was moving toward indictments that would name Napolitano among the defendants. The specifics of the charges would relate to the activities uncovered in part through the undercover operation: illegal gambling, extortionate credit, and other forms of organized profit-making. To Napolitano and his circle, government efforts of this kind were both an expected occupational hazard and an ominous sign. Prison was always a possibility in their line of work, but the scope of RICO prosecutions, with their potential for long sentences and asset seizures, represented a more systemic threat. In this tightening vice, pressure from within the Bonanno family and pressure from outside law enforcement, Napolitano leaned even more heavily on the bonds he believed he had forged. He trusted his crew to stand with him, to maintain silence under questioning, to continue generating money even as investigations multiplied. And he trusted Donny enough not only to include him in sensitive conversations, but to consider proposing him for initiation as a full member of the family, an extraordinary step for someone whom he had known, in truth, for only a few years. For the FBI, that prospect presented both an opportunity and a crisis. An undercover agent being put forward to become a formal member of a major crime family was unprecedented, and it underscored how deeply the operation had penetrated the Bonanno structure. At the same time, the induction process, by its very nature, involved expectations and rituals that no responsible agency could allow an agent to actually fulfill. To proceed further would mean carrying the deception into a territory that raised serious ethical and legal questions. As 1981 approached, the separate tracks of this story were converging. Inside the Bonanno world, the rivalry between Raselli's loyalists and the rebellious captains was coming to a head. Outside, federal prosecutors were preparing charges that would rely heavily on the evidence gathered by Donny and his handlers. And at the center of both storms stood Dominick, Sonny Black, Napolitano, a man who believed that his careful reading of people and situations had carried him safely through decades of danger. He could not know that the person he had most welcomed into his confidence was quietly helping assemble the case that would tear open the secrecy he had spent his entire life defending. In the winter of 1980, the mood inside the Bonanno family was brittle and suspicious. The formal boss, Philip Raselli, was still serving time in federal prison, but on the street his name carried weight among a corps of loyal captains. Dominick, Sonny Black Napolitano was one of them. He and his close ally Joseph Massino represented a rising generation determined to keep the family under Raselli's banner and within the traditional structure recognized by the other New York crime families. Arrayed against them were three powerful captains: Alphonse, Sonny Red Indelicato, Philip Giacone, and Dominick Trinchera, who believed they could steer the Bonannos away from Raselli and his backers and seize control for themselves. Law enforcement, watching from the outside, could tell something was developing. Surveillance teams noted unusual patterns, more frequent closed-door meetings, cars gathering late at night around certain social clubs, and quieter, more guarded conversations among men normally comfortable holding court in public bars. Wiretaps picked up snippets of talk about problems, the other side, and getting straightened out. Within this atmosphere, Napolitano's careful, watchful nature came to the forefront. He knew from the turmoil of the 1960s that internal disputes could be as deadly as any confrontation with police. In later court testimony and accounts by undercover FBI agent Joseph Pistone, who was still operating under the identity of Donny Brasco, a broad outline of what happened next emerges. The three rebellious captains, widely known by their nicknames and reputations, were maneuvering to challenge Raselli's authority outright. According to law enforcement and Underworld sources, they discussed the possibility of eliminating key Raselli loyalists, including Massino and possibly Napolitano himself, in order to clear the way for their own leadership. Word of these plans filtered back through informants and loyalists. For the Raselli camp, the stakes could not have been higher. A successful move by Indelicato, Giacone, and Trinchera would almost certainly mean violent repercussions for those who had openly backed the imprisoned boss. At this level, the Bonanno family could not act in a vacuum. The broader governing body known as the Commission, leaders of the major New York crime families, had a direct interest in the outcome. They had already been unsettled by the earlier chaos under Carmine Galante, whose unchecked violence and unilateral decisions had angered other families. Another round of internal warfare risked drawing unwanted law enforcement crackdowns and destabilizing long-standing arrangements. According to multiple later accounts, the Commission signaled its support for the Raselli faction and its impatience with the three rebellious captains. That understanding gave cover for a decisive response. On May 5, 1981, the long-simmering conflict reached its bloody turning point. Indelicato, Giacone, and Trinchera were lured to what they believed would be a reconciliation meeting at a Brooklyn location controlled by their enemies. The full logistics of the trap only became clear years later, through FBI investigations and cooperating witnesses, but the essentials are widely documented. The three captains walked into an ambush. They did not walk out. Their deaths removed, in a single strike, the most prominent internal challengers to Raselli's rule. Napolitano was not a triggerman in that attack, but sources inside law enforcement and the underworld have consistently identified him as one of the planners and supervisors of the operation on behalf of the Raselli faction. It fell to men like him and Massino to organize logistics, to ensure that the chosen site was secure, and to arrange for backup and cleanup. For obvious reasons, they kept those roles as quiet as possible. These were decisions made in small, tightly controlled circles, not subjects for open barroom discussion. In Pistone's later recollection, those days were marked by a heightened sense of impending action. Napolitano spoke guardedly about things that needed to be taken care of, warned that the situation was dangerous, and ensured that his trusted men were positioned where he wanted them. Donnie was not in the room when the three captains were killed, but he was close enough to feel the gravity of what had happened. The next time he saw some of the senior figures, their manner had changed. The tension that had filled the air for months gave way to a hard, watchful quiet. The family had chosen a side, and there was no stepping back. The impact inside the Banana organization was immediate. With the most aggressive internal rivals gone, the Raselli faction moved quickly to consolidate power. Other captains who had been undecided or quietly sympathetic to the rebels now fell into line, recognizing which way events had gone. For the commission, the removal of the three rebellious figures signaled that the Bananos, under Raselli's camp, were once again aligning themselves with the broader interests of New York organized crime. While formal recognition and influence would ebb and flow over the next few years, the balance of power inside the family had been decisively altered. For Napolitano personally, the aftermath of the ambush marked the high point of his influence. He was now more than just a neighborhood capo. He had proved his loyalty to the officially recognized boss, participated in a major internal realignment, and demonstrated his ability to manage sensitive operations without immediate fallout. Law enforcement reports from this period increasingly portrayed him as one of the key figures in daily Banana affairs, someone whose movements and conversations were of particular interest. Inside his crew, his calm, controlled style did not change, but his authority was clearer than ever. Men like Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero took their cues from him. When disputes arose over the division of gambling profits or the handling of stubborn debtors, his word carried greater weight. The Motion Lounge remained one of his principal bases, but his reach extended into other boroughs and down to Florida, where his associates continued to seek opportunities in bars, clubs, and seasonal rackets. In this new landscape, the undercover agent using the name Donnie Brasco found himself even more deeply embedded. His association with Ruggiero and the Florida venture, combined with his steady performance in New York, had made him part of Napolitano's trusted inner circle. In Pistone's later testimony and writings, he describes how, in the months after the three captains' murders, Napolitano became increasingly open with him about internal matters, speaking in ways he would never have considered with a casual associate. One of the clearest signs of that trust came in talk of induction. Within the Banana world, as in other New York families, becoming a made man was the highest formal recognition available. It signified full membership in the organization, a binding oath of loyalty, a new level of protection, and an expectation of lifelong obedience to the family's rules. The criteria were strict: Italian heritage, a record of reliable service, and often demonstrated willingness to engage in serious violence on the organization's behalf. According to Pistone, Napolitano told him in 1981 that he intended to propose him for membership. He spoke as a sponsor, outlining what would be required: patience, continued earnings, and, unavoidably, the taking of a life to prove irrevocable commitment. For Napolitano, suggesting that Donnie should be put forward was not a casual remark. It meant staking his own reputation on the newcomer's reliability. If a man he had vouched for ever turned out to be disloyal, the responsibility would rest squarely with him. That possibility must have seemed remote to him at the time. For years, Donnie had done everything expected. He kept his mouth shut around outsiders, followed orders, took losses without complaint, and brought in steady money from deals carefully orchestrated under FBI supervision. He had also shared the risks of the Florida expansion, where the margins between success and trouble were thin. To Napolitano, all this looked like a textbook record of proven loyalty. The internal war, however, was not entirely over. One conspicuous survivor of the upheaval was Alponte's Bruno Indelicato, the son of the slain capo Sonny Red. Bruno, himself a Bonanno soldier, had not been present at the ambush that took his father's life. In the logic of the Underworld, that made him both a potential avenger and an unresolved threat. As long as he was alive and free, there was always the chance that he might try to retaliate against those he held responsible, including members of the Rasselli faction. In the weeks and months following the three captains' deaths, searching for Bruno became a priority for Napolitano's side. Law enforcement surveillance and Pistone's own accounts show that Donnie and Ruggiero were repeatedly sent to look for him at known hangouts, tracking down leads on his whereabouts. They drove past social clubs and bars where he had once been seen, checked on apartments, and monitored friends and relatives. Each unsuccessful pass heightened the sense that, when he finally was found, the response would be swift. At some point in this tense period, Napolitano made a decision that, for him, represented the ultimate expression of trust in the man he knew as Donnie Brasco. According to Pistone's later descriptions, Napolitano assigned him a role that went beyond errands or surveillance. He was told that if and when Bruno Indelicato was located, he, along with Ruggiero, would be expected to carry out the killing. For the undercover agent, this was a moment he and his FBI handlers had long known might come, but hoped to avoid. From Napolitano's perspective, the assignment made perfect sense. If Donnie was truly to be considered for full membership, there had to be a demonstration that he was willing to do what had long been understood as the organization's harshest work. Entrusting him with such a responsibility also signaled to others in the crew that Napolitano considered him as good as one of their own. In a world where suspicion could be fatal, that kind of visible endorsement mattered. Pistone later recalled specific conversations in which Napolitano outlined not only the expectation that Bruno would be killed, but also the practical aftermath, where a body might be hidden, how a house could be modified to conceal evidence, and the importance of leaving no trace that could tie the act back to the family. These were not abstract discussions. They were logistical planning sessions, reflecting years of experience in minimizing risk. For the FBI, hearing about, and in some cases recording, such plans highlighted the depth of operational knowledge Napolitano possessed, and the methodical way he applied it. Inside the Bureau, the assignment to kill Bruno Indelicato crystallized a dilemma that had been building from the very beginning of the operation. The FBI had always drawn clear boundaries for its undercover agents. They were not to initiate or commit acts of serious violence. Up to this point, Donnie had been present on the edges of dangerous situations, and he had witnessed the effects of violence, but he had not directly taken part in killing anyone. Now he was being ordered, by a man who fully believed in him, to do exactly that. From a purely investigative standpoint, allowing the situation to proceed might have yielded even more evidence of how the Bonanno family handled internal threats. But from legal, ethical, and moral perspectives, it was unacceptable. There could be no justification for condoning the planned murder of Bruno Indelicato, regardless of his own criminal involvement. Nor could the FBI permit one of its agents to cross the line into lethal violence. The internal discussions at the Bureau grew urgent. Supervisors, prosecutors, and higher-level officials weighed the enormous gains the operation had already produced against the new, intolerable risk. At the same time, the sheer length of the undercover work, by then approaching 6 years inside the mafia world, was taking a personal toll on Pistone. Living full-time under an assumed identity, Constantly navigating danger and maintaining dual loyalties had its own psychological and physical costs. The FBI had to consider the strain on its agent as well as the potential collapse of his cover if anything went wrong. The more deeply he became entangled in plans for serious violence, the greater the chances that a misstep, a hesitation, or a revealing comment under stress could expose him. Ultimately, the Bureau reached a decision. The operation, as extraordinary as it had been, could not continue. They had already accumulated extensive evidence of illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and conspiracy. They had gained unprecedented insight into the structure and day-to-day functioning of the Bonanno family, including the roles played by men like Napolitano. Now, with their agent being tasked to commit a murder, the line had been reached. It was time to extract him and move to the next phase: indictments, arrests, and courtroom battles that would attempt to hold the organization accountable. For Napolitano, in the early months of 1981, none of this was visible. From his vantage point, his life's work seemed, in many ways, to be reaching a kind of grim culmination. He had climbed from a Brooklyn boy running errands in a Williamsburg neighborhood club to a captain whose decisions shaped the direction of a major crime family. He had chosen his alliances carefully, come out on top in the most recent internal conflict, and positioned himself close to the imprisoned boss whose authority he had defended. He had even, in his own mind, discovered and nurtured a promising protege in Donnie, a man he believed could carry forward the values of loyalty and discipline that he prized. He moved through his routines, tending his pigeons, holding court at the Motion Lounge, checking on gambling operations and loans, issuing instructions to his men, without suspecting that the person he trusted most from outside his blood family was quietly preparing to disappear. The very qualities that had made Napolitano so effective for so long, his reliance on tested personal relationships, his confidence in his ability to read character, his belief that loyalty would be repaid in kind, were about to leave him exposed in a way he could not yet imagine. As the FBI planned the end of the Donnie Brasco operation, the gap between his understanding of the world and the reality closing in around him grew wider with each passing day. In July of 1981, the long-running concealment at the heart of Dominick Napolitano's world reached its breaking point, and he was the last to know. Inside the FBI, the decision had finally been made. Their undercover agent, living for years as jewel thief Donnie Brasco, had been ordered to participate in the planned killing of Bruno Indelicato, the surviving son of one of the 3 captains murdered in the Bonanno internal war. Allowing the operation to continue under those circumstances was out of the question. Whatever more might be gathered, no investigation could justify crossing the line into an arranged killing. After nearly 6 years inside the Bonanno family, Donnie would have to vanish. For the agent who had spent almost all of his waking hours in the orbit of men like Benjamin Ruggiero and Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano, the order to pull out was both a relief and a burden. Professionally, he understood the impossibility of the situation. Personally, he had lived so long in his assumed identity that he had come to know the habits, voices, and fears of the men around him, with an intimacy that most people reserve for relatives or lifelong friends. He knew precisely how seriously they took concepts like loyalty and betrayal, and he understood what would happen when they learned who he really was. In those final days, he did what he could to withdraw without arousing immediate suspicion. Excuses were made, meetings were postponed. Then, on orders from his superiors, contact was cut completely. To the men at the Motion Lounge, the absence of Donnie must at first have seemed like one of the many temporary disappearances common in their world. Perhaps a trip, a family crisis, or some trouble in Florida that needed hands-on attention. After all, men in their line of work did not always explain where they were going or when they would be back. The FBI did not leave the revelation to rumor. Within days of ending the operation, federal officials moved to take advantage of the evidence they had gathered and to protect those, like Ruggiero, who were likely to bear the brunt of underworld retaliation. Agents quietly intercepted Ruggiero on his way to what he believed was a routine summons from higher-ups, an invitation that, in the coded language of the mafia, often meant a fatal meeting when trust had been broken. Instead of walking into a trap set by his own organization, he found himself in handcuffs, facing the justice system he had spent a lifetime evading. At the same time, FBI agents went to see Napolitano directly. According to later accounts, they appeared at his Brooklyn residence and told him plainly that Donnie Brasco was not the small-time jewel thief he had believed him to be, but an FBI agent who had been recording and reporting on the Bonanno family for years. Witnesses described Napolitano's reaction as controlled but unmistakably shaken. A man who prided himself on his ability to read people, who had spent his adult life distinguishing reliable allies from potential informants, was confronted with the reality that he had allowed a federal agent into the very center of his crew. Within days, federal authorities made the undercover operation public. Press conferences announced that an FBI agent had infiltrated the Bonanno family at a high level, gathering evidence of gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and conspiracies. Newspapers ran photos of the man the underworld had known as Donnie Brasco, now identified by his real name. The public, reading these accounts, saw the operation largely as a daring law enforcement victory. Inside the world of the mafia, the news landed like an earthquake. For the Bonannos and other New York families, the infiltration represented not just a successful investigation, but an unprecedented violation of their most cherished assumption, that their internal bonds, their rituals, and their selective recruitment could keep law enforcement at bay. Any man could be arrested. That was an accepted risk. But to have an outsider move undetected for years within a family's ranks, earning money with them, sitting at their tables, listening as they discussed internal disputes, that was a humiliation that required explanation, and in the logic of that world, punishment. Attention quickly focused on the men who had brought Donnie closest. There was no mystery about that. Everyone knew that he had first attached himself to Benjamin Ruggiero, and that it was Ruggiero who had introduced him to Dominick Napolitano and vouched for his reliability. Over time, as the Florida venture developed, and as Donnie was given more responsibility, it was Napolitano who had become his principal sponsor, the captain who had taken him into his crew and spoken on his behalf. In the chain of accountability that governed the mafia's internal affairs, that made Napolitano centrally responsible for the disaster. Law enforcement surveillance and later testimony indicate that in the days after the operation was exposed, Napolitano understood exactly how his world now saw him. He had not cooperated with authorities. He had never given information or signaled any wavering in his loyalty to the organization. Yet by trusting the wrong man, by failing to detect that Donnie was an agent, he had exposed the family to arrest, indictment, and potential long-term damage. For that, in his understanding of the code he had lived by, there was no defense. A telling detail circulated later through accounts from those who had been close to him. He did not try to shift the blame to Ruggiero or to anyone else. He acknowledged that he had been the one to open the door, the one to press Donnie's case for deeper inclusion, the one to speak of him as a man worthy of being made. In some retellings, he is said to have told an associate that he would take his medicine because he had been the one responsible. Whatever the exact words, the underlying sentiment is consistent with everything known about his personality and his adherence to the internal rules of his world. Meanwhile, the broader repercussions of the infiltration were beginning to unfold. Prosecutors, relying heavily on information from the undercover operation, prepared a series of indictments targeting Bonanno members and associates. These cases focused on the core criminal activities that had long funded the family's operations: illegal gambling enterprises, high-interest loans to gamblers and business owners, and schemes that extracted money under the implied threat of violence. While those charges did not encompass every aspect of Bonanno activity, They drew a detailed, documented picture of how men like Napolitano and his peers turned everyday vulnerabilities into steady profit. Other New York families were also paying close attention. The Commission, the umbrella body that coordinated relations among the major organizations, was said to be furious. Not only had the Bananos allowed a federal agent into their inner circles, but they had done so at a time when they were already under scrutiny for internal disorder and previous leadership crises. In the tightly interconnected world of New York organized crime, one family's failures could bring investigations down on everyone. Stories circulated, later echoed in courtrooms and memoirs, that the Bonanno family was informally sidelined from commission business for a time following the revelation of the Brasco operation. Whether or not the exclusion was formal or simply a matter of other bosses keeping their distance, the message was clear. Until they put their house in order and punished those seen as responsible, they would be regarded as unreliable partners. Within this pressure cooker environment, the question of what would happen to Napolitano acquired a grim inevitability. Men who had worked with him for years knew precisely what the usual response would be when someone's actions, even unintentional, were judged to have caused catastrophic harm. He knew it as well. Having built his life on the rules and expectations of his world, he had little room to argue for an exception when those same rules now pointed toward him. In the weeks after the FBI visit, he continued to move through parts of his routine, but witnesses later described a man who understood that he was living on borrowed time. He still tended his pigeons, still appeared at certain neighborhood spots, but some of the old regularity was gone. Conversations with close associates were shorter, more guarded. He had to know that discussions about his fate were taking place in rooms he no longer entered, among men who now weighed whether his continued existence posed a risk to the family's fragile standing. On August 17, 1981, that waiting ended. Accounts based on later testimony and FBI investigations agree on the broad outline. Napolitano was summoned to a meeting under circumstances that, to someone with his experience, would have been heavy with meaning. He was expected at a house used by Bonanno associates, away from the public eye and away from his usual haunts. Before he left his own home, he took actions that spoke louder than any recorded words. Neighbors and later witnesses recalled that he quietly removed jewelry, a watch, rings, that he had worn regularly, and passed them along with his keys to a man who helped care for his pigeons. He reportedly asked that his birds be looked after. Such gestures in his world were not casual. A man going to an ordinary meeting did not give away personal possessions or make arrangements for beloved animals. To those who knew the code, it was the behavior of someone who believed, or at least strongly suspected, that he would not be coming back. What happened inside the house that day unfolded out of public view, but subsequent court testimony and investigative findings have sketched the essentials. He was confronted by fellow members of his own organization, men acting under orders that traced back to the leadership he had supported for years. In their eyes, and under the logic of their code, he had to be held accountable for the infiltration. In that basement, the long arc of his career came to an abrupt and violent end. There was no trial, no formal defense, no chance to argue that he had been merely deceived rather than treacherous. The organization's judgment was final. In the immediate aftermath, he simply disappeared. To neighbors on his quiet Brooklyn block, it might have seemed as though he had suddenly moved away, leaving behind his house and his rooftop pigeons. To law enforcement, the timing and circumstances made the truth obvious. An experienced mafia captain, facing intense internal and external pressure after the revelation of a devastating undercover operation, had been summoned to a secluded location and never seen again. For the FBI and prosecutors who had built the case around the Donnie Brasco operation, it was a grim confirmation of the personal cost their work had imposed on the people they had targeted. For years, Napolitano's body was not recovered. His name appeared in indictments related to the evidence gathered during the undercover operation, but proceedings against him could not go forward. Official documents often listed him as deceased or presumed deceased, a silent acknowledgement of the gap between the formal requirements of the justice system and the realities of underworld retribution. Families of those involved were left with absence rather than funerals, rumors rather than confirmed details. The story did not end completely in 1981. Decades later, in the early 2000s, human remains were discovered at a property linked to Bonanno Associates. Forensic testing, including DNA analysis, eventually confirmed what many had long believed. They belonged to Dominick Napolitano. The confirmation did not change the broad outline of what was already known, but it provided a belated, tangible closure to a disappearance that had long hovered at the edge of official records. Within the Bonanno family, his death sent a signal that no one could miss. Here was a man who had never cooperated with authorities, who had spent his entire adult life enforcing the organization's rules, paying with his life not for betrayal in the conventional sense, but for a failure of judgment that allowed an outsider into the family's inner sanctum. Others could draw their own conclusions about what that meant for their own futures. The message was stark. In a system built on secrecy and loyalty, the price for a mistake at the wrong moment could be the same as the price for outright treachery. Meanwhile, the legal cases built in part on the Donnie Brasco operation moved forward. Trials in the early and mid-1980s used testimony from the undercover agent and other witnesses to lay bare the routine functioning of the Bonanno crew controlled by Napolitano and his peers. Jurors heard about backroom card games, high-interest loans, and the coded conversations that linked small neighborhood operations to a larger, structured enterprise. They saw photographs of the Motion Lounge and other meeting places. They listened as the undercover agent, now testifying under his own name, described the man he had known as Sonny Black. His careful manner, his insistence on punctuality, his faith in a code that had ultimately demanded his life. In these courtroom narratives, Napolitano appeared as both a figure of influence and a cautionary example. Prosecutors presented him as a key player in a criminal enterprise that exploited vulnerable people for profit and perpetuated a culture of intimidation. At the same time, his fate illustrated the internal brutality of the organization itself, how even long-serving, loyal members could be eliminated when they were judged to have become liabilities. The law did not get to judge him. His own world had done that first, and far more harshly. In the years that followed, books, films, and television programs based on the Donnie Brasco operation would bring Napolitano's name to an audience far beyond Williamsburg or the circles of organized crime specialists. Many of these portrayals drew heavily on Pistone's recollections, emphasizing the paradox of a man who could be, by many accounts, personally courteous and soft-spoken, yet deeply enmeshed in a system that inflicted fear and financial ruin on others. The pigeons on his Brooklyn rooftop, the quiet routine of his days, and the almost ritual calm with which he seemed to meet his own death all contributed to a complex, unsettling image. Yet behind the drama and the storytelling, the historical record remains clear on certain fundamentals. Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano rose from a working-class Brooklyn childhood into a position of real power within the Bonanno crime family. He did so by adhering to and enforcing a set of rules that prioritized organizational loyalty over individual conscience and profit over the well-being of strangers. When those same rules turned on him after the FBI's undercover operation was exposed, he accepted their judgment without visible resistance. His life and death, taken together, offer a stark illustration of how the codes of organized crime could both elevate and destroy the people who believed in them most deeply. When the news of Dominick Napolitano's disappearance first filtered through law enforcement circles in late August 1981, it confirmed what many agents had expected from the moment they revealed the Donnie Brasco operation. The Bonanno family, already reeling from internal war and federal scrutiny, had done what its code demanded. It had turned inward, found someone to blame for the humiliation of being infiltrated, and imposed its own sentence. The man who had spent decades defending that code had become one of its victims. Inside the FBI, the reaction to his death was complicated. On one level, agents and prosecutors viewed it as a stark demonstration of just how dangerous the world they had penetrated could be. No one doubted that if the Bananos had discovered the truth a few months earlier, before the Bureau pulled its man out, the fate reserved for the agent would have been far worse. On another level, there was a recognition that, though Napolitano had never cooperated with law enforcement and had never intended to help them, his death was inextricably linked to an operation that the Bureau regarded as one of its major successes. The undercover work he had unknowingly enabled would now be used to dismantle much of what he had spent his life building. The legal machinery set in motion by the Donnie Brasco investigation began grinding forward almost immediately. On the basis of recordings, surveillance, and the agent's testimony, federal prosecutors assembled a series of indictments that reached into the core of the Banana organization. The charges did not attempt to capture every facet of the family's activities. That would have been impossible, but they focused on the bread-and-butter crimes that kept the organization afloat. Illegal gambling operations that stretched across boroughs and state lines, loans with punishing, often unpayable interest rates, and schemes in which business owners were pressed for payments in exchange for protection from trouble created by the very people demanding the money. In New York, a key case in the early 1980s brought charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, against several leading Banana figures. Among the defendants were imprisoned boss Philip Rasselli, capo Joseph Massino, and soldier Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. The RICO framework allowed prosecutors to treat the Banana family as an ongoing criminal enterprise and to present a pattern of activity, betting parlors, card games, loan collections, and more, as part of a single conspiracy. In this narrative, Dominick Napolitano appeared repeatedly, even though he was no longer alive to face trial. Transcripts and testimony described him as a capo with his own crew, a man who held court at the Motion Lounge, directed gambling and loan sharking operations, and served as a key ally of Rasselli and Massino in both business and internal power struggles. In court, the undercover agent, no longer Donnie Brasco, but Joseph Pistone, became a central witness. Under heavy security and continuing protective measures, he described to jurors how he had first met Ruggiero, how that relationship had led him to the Motion Lounge, and how he had gradually been drawn into the orbit of Napolitano's crew. He recounted conversations in which Napolitano explained the family's rules, discussed the internal war with the three rebellious captains, and laid out expectations for earnings and conduct. When lawyers asked him about Napolitano's demeanor, Pistone spoke of a man who was typically calm and businesslike, not given to loud boasting, who measured men by whether they showed up when they were supposed to and delivered what they had promised. The jurors saw photographs taken during surveillance operations, the outside of the Motion Lounge, Napolitano walking on Brooklyn streets with Ruggiero, gatherings at which familiar faces cropped up again and again. They listened to recordings in which voices discussed betting lines, debt collections, and the need to keep law enforcement at arm's length. Even when Napolitano himself was not audible on a particular tape, his name surfaced as the authority behind decisions, the man whose approval was required before certain actions could be taken. In the prosecutor's narrative, he became both an organizer and a symbol of the disciplined, low-profile mid-level leadership that made the Banana family so durable. The RICO cases did not revolve around lurid tales of spectacular violence. Prosecutors were careful not to sensationalize what they presented. Instead, they emphasized the steady, grinding nature of the rackets, the way neighborhood gamblers were encouraged to bet more than they could afford, the way debts snowballed until borrowers saw no way out, the way small business owners found themselves paying monthly envelopes just to be left alone. The question of who had personally carried a gun on a particular day mattered less than the clear picture of a system in which fear and implied threat were tools of trade. Convictions followed. Rosselli, already serving time, faced new penalties. Massino and other Bonanno figures received lengthy sentences. Ruggiero, whose closeness to both Napolitano and the undercover agent made him a particularly visible figure in the case, was convicted and would spend most of the rest of his life in prison. Through it all, Napolitano remained a kind of ghostly presence in the proceedings, never appearing in the dock, never answering a question, but constantly invoked as a central figure in the structure the government was describing. Beyond the courtroom, the Brasco operation and its aftermath began to reshape the broader landscape of law enforcement efforts against organized crime. The success of a long-term undercover infiltration, combined with the powerful new leverage provided by RICO statutes, encouraged federal agencies to pursue similarly deep investigations of other crime families across the country. At the same time, the revelation that a federal agent had been able to live for years as a trusted associate inside the Bonannos sent shock waves through the mafia itself. Within Bonanno circles, the lesson drawn from the Napolitano episode was harsh. Social clubs and bars that had once operated almost like open offices for captains and soldiers were re-examined. Under new leaders, especially when Joseph Massino eventually emerged as a dominant figure on the street in the late 1980s and 1990s, there was a deliberate effort to limit the kind of exposure that had allowed an outsider like Donnie to blend into the background for so long. Some long-standing clubhouses were shut or used less openly. Meetings were moved to more secluded venues or conducted while walking, away from the stationary microphones that had captured earlier conversations. Massino, who had known Napolitano well and risen alongside him under Rosselli, took the Donnie Brasco fiasco as a cautionary tale. Later cooperating witnesses would describe a leadership style that, while rooted in traditional mafia hierarchy, was also significantly more paranoid and security conscious than what had come before. He discouraged the casual use of words like mafia or cosa nostra, preferring vague phrases like the guys when business had to be discussed. He worried about bugs, wiretaps, and informants. The shadow of what had happened under Napolitano's watch hung over these precautions. Whether explicitly invoked or not, the memory of an undercover agent being on the verge of formal induction into the family was a warning no one could ignore. Outside these internal adjustments, the public story of the Donnie Brasco operation began to take on a life of its own. In 1987, Pistone published his account of the undercover years, laying out in extended narrative form the relationships he had built, the crimes he had witnessed, and the personalities of the men around him. Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano appeared throughout that narrative as one of the central figures. The careful capo who taught him the ropes, the man whose good opinion he had to win, and finally, the target of a fatal internal reckoning after the FBI revealed the truth. The book's emphasis was necessarily shaped by Pistone's perspective, and by the requirements of protecting ongoing investigations and the safety of those involved. It could not reproduce every detail of what had been said behind closed doors, nor could it fully capture the breadth of Napolitano's life beyond the years of the operation. But it did fix certain images in the public imagination. The Brooklyn row house with pigeons on the roof, the Motion Lounge as a cramped but significant hub of criminal commerce, and Napolitano as a disciplined, almost austere underworld figure who presided over it. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the cumulative effect of undercover work, RICO prosecutions, and a growing stream of cooperating witnesses, former mobsters who chose to testify in exchange for reduced sentences and protection, gradually eroded the power and mystique of New York's traditional crime families. The Bananos, already battered by internal strife and the Brasco scandal, had to contend with a new reality. The code of silence that Dominick Napolitano had lived and died by was no longer unbreakable. In this changed environment, details of his final hours and the mechanics of his murder slowly emerged. In the early 2000s, a high-ranking Banano member named Frank Lino began cooperating with authorities. In debriefings and later testimony, he provided an insider's account of the day in August 1981 when Napolitano was taken to his death. Lino described how he had driven with Napolitano to the house where the killing took place, and how Napolitano had, on the way, made remarks that suggested he knew, or at least strongly suspected, what awaited him. To law enforcement, these accounts confirmed the significance of the small gestures witnesses had seen that morning. The removal of jewelry, the handing over of keys, the quiet concern for his pigeons. Lino also helped lead investigators to the burial site where Napolitano's remains had been hidden for more than 2 decades. In 2002, skeletal remains were unearthed on a property linked to Banano Associates. Forensic experts used dental records and DNA testing to establish that they were, in fact, those of Dominick Napolitano. The discovery did not change the legal outcomes of the case. No one doubted by then that he had been killed in 1981, but it gave a physical reality to a story that had long existed in a kind of limbo between law enforcement assumption and underworld rumor. Further testimony and court documents identified the men believed to have carried out the shooting itself: Baldo Amato and Ronald Filocomo, both Banano associates who, decades later, would face charges that included counts related to Napolitano's murder. In these later prosecutions, the man who had once been a defendant or unindicted co-conspirator in RICO cases now appeared in a different role, as a murder victim in the racketeering narrative used against his former colleagues. The organization he had helped to strengthen and defend was now, in the eyes of the law, responsible for his unlawful killing. The late confirmation of his fate also gave journalists and historians new material with which to refine their understanding of his life. With physical evidence in hand and cooperating witnesses on record, the broad outlines of his final days solidified. The image that emerged was consistent with what had been inferred earlier. A man who recognized that, by the rules he had lived under, his failure to identify an undercover agent in his midst was an unforgivable offense, and who chose to meet the consequences without running to authorities or attempting a desperate, last-minute deal. At the same time, the broader cultural representation of the Donnie Brasco story, particularly after the release of the 1997 film adaptation, continued to shape how the public thought about Napolitano. In the movie, a character based on him, played with a mix of severity and melancholy, became for many viewers the human face of the old mafia code, a man whose commitment to loyalty was turned against him. Dramatizations inevitably took artistic license, compressing timelines and inventing dialogue, but they were rooted in the real history of a Brooklyn capo who had brought an outsider into his home and was destroyed when that outsider revealed himself as an agent. For communities like Williamsburg, the legacy of his life and death was tangled. On one level, older residents could recall an era when men like Napolitano were simply part of the neighborhood landscape, figures who were known, if not always understood, whose clubs and bars were as much a part of the block as churches and grocery stores. On another level, younger generations grew up in a city where the visible presence of such figures had diminished, replaced by different forms of crime and different economic challenges. The idea of a local social club doubling as a command center for a criminal organization now seemed like something from another time. Looking back across the years from his birth in 1930 to the discovery of his remains in the early 2000s, a long arc becomes visible. As a boy, Napolitano had come of age in a Brooklyn defined by immigrant struggle, where informal networks and neighborhood power brokers filled gaps left by distant institutions. As a young man, he had gravitated into the orbit of one of the city's major crime families, learning its ways and internalizing its emphasis on loyalty and secrecy. As a mid-level leader, he had enforced those rules on others, overseeing rackets that extracted money from the vulnerabilities of ordinary people. And in the end, when the code he believed in demanded that someone pay for the family's humiliation at the hands of an undercover agent, he accepted that it would be him. The years after his death did not erase his influence. Within the Banana organization, even as leadership changed and new faces rose, his story remained a reference point, an example of how quickly status could collapse and how little protection past service offered when the family felt aggrieved or endangered. Within law enforcement, his case became a study in both the risks and the rewards of deep undercover work. For scholars and observers of organized crime, his life provided a detailed, documented example of how a man could move from the margins of an immigrant neighborhood into the heart of a criminal hierarchy, and how that hierarchy, in turn, could turn on him without hesitation. By the beginning of the 21st century, very few of the men who had shared his daily world were still active on the streets. Many were in prison, others had died, quietly or violently. Still others had, at various points, chosen to cooperate with the authorities they had once sworn to resist. Yet in trial transcripts, in declassified FBI files, in memoirs and histories, the name Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano continued to appear. It marked the intersection of two forces: the tradition-bound, inward-looking world of mid-century New York organized crime, and the evolving, increasingly sophisticated machinery of American law enforcement. His life, and the way it ended, showed how those forces collided, and how, in that collision, neither side emerged unchanged. By the time investigators pulled bones from the damp earth of a Queens property in 2002, most of the men who had walked with Dominick Napolitano through Brooklyn streets were gone from those sidewalks. Some were in federal prisons, some buried in marked graves, some vanished into the anonymity of witness protection. For more than 20 years, his fate had been an open secret in law enforcement. He had gone to a meeting in August 1981 and never returned. Yet it was only when forensic teams matched dental work and DNA to the missing capo from Williamsburg that the last, formal piece of the puzzle slid into place. The man who had spent his life avoiding the official gaze of the state had finally been entered into its records as a confirmed homicide victim. The discovery gave a kind of reluctant solidity to a story that had long existed in whispers and lines of testimony. In courtrooms during the 1980s and 1990s, cooperating witnesses had spoken of the day he disappeared, of the car rides, of the house where he was led downstairs and not brought back up. They described the internal decision that someone had to pay for the humiliation of the Donnie Brasco revelation, and how the logic of the code pointed toward the captain who had vouched for the infiltrator. Now, with a body and a grave, that narrative had material proof. It underscored what observers of organized crime had been saying for years. Whatever sense of honor or discipline existed inside the mafia, it could turn with equal force against its own. Reconstructing the man behind the headlines requires stepping back from the stark outline of his rise and fall and looking more closely at the details preserved in FBI files, courtroom transcripts, and the recollections of the undercover agent who knew him best. In those sources, a portrait emerges not just of a position, Banana Capo, but of a person who moved through a very specific social world, shaped by time, place, and the internal culture of his organization. On an ordinary day in the late 1970s, someone watching from across the street might have seen him leave his modest brick row house in Brooklyn in a dark jacket and slacks, walking with a measured gait toward a parked car. Before that, he might have spent an hour on the roof with his pigeons, checking feed, examining wings, scanning the sky as the birds circled and settled. To neighbors who were not part of the underworld, This was perhaps the most visible part of his routine. A middle-aged man with carefully groomed dark hair, quietly tending his birds in the same way older men in the neighborhood played cards on stoops or watched grandchildren in the park. Once he slid behind the wheel and drove off, another version of his life began. At the Motion Lounge in Williamsburg, where he based much of his cruise operations, he settled at a favored table and received a steady stream of visitors. Soldiers, lower-level associates, messengers from other crews. According to FBI surveillance reports and Piston's later descriptions, these encounters followed an unspoken script. Those who approached him stood or sat slightly to one side, often speaking in low tones. He rarely raised his voice. He listened, asked a few questions, gave instructions. Money was passed in envelopes. Updates on gambling takes and loan collections were relayed, and problems, someone late with payments, a dispute over territory, a rumor of police interest, were presented for his judgment. The work was methodical, not dramatic. His crew's gambling operations required constant attention, setting betting lines, balancing risks, ensuring bookmakers were not skimming too much before turning over the house's share. Loan accounts had to be tracked, with each borrower's payment schedule and reliability noted. A missed payment might trigger a reminder call, then a visit, then an escalation. None of this required him to be physically present at a doorstep demanding money. He had people for that. But he set the tone. Former associates later described him as someone who expected results without scenes, a man who did not want public displays that could invite police attention, but who also did not tolerate repeated excuses. Within that environment, his interactions with the man he knew as Donnie Brasco stand out in the historical record because they were observed and remembered in unusual detail. Piston, writing after the fact, recalled specific conversations in which Napolitano tried to teach him what it meant to belong to the banana world. In one oft-quoted exchange, Napolitano explained the absolute nature of the commitment he expected. "If I tell you to kill somebody," he said, "you do it. If I tell you to kill your own mother, you do it." The line has been repeated so often in books and films that it risks becoming a cliché, but in context, it was a blunt statement of how he understood his world. Personal feeling and ordinary morality were secondary to the demands of the organization. He did not present this as cruelty for its own sake. From his perspective, it was about clarity. A man who hesitated when told to act, a man who stopped to weigh family ties or qualms of conscience, was, in his view, not suited to the life he had chosen. The promise of being with the family, of receiving its protection and sharing in its profits, came with the price of unquestioning obedience in moments of crisis. That Napolitano could articulate such a stance calmly, without bravado, helps explain why he was trusted to oversee sensitive matters. His subordinates knew where he stood. There was no ambiguity in his expectations. At the same time, the record shows moments of ordinary human concern that complicate any attempt to reduce him to a stereotype. Piston described how Napolitano checked on him when he was supposedly ill, making sure he had money and a place to stay. Neighbors remembered him paying attention to his pigeons with what looked like genuine affection, asking a local boy to keep feeding them when he was away. These details do not cancel out the harm caused by his criminal activities, but they demonstrate a capacity to compartmentalize, to draw a sharp distinction between the circle of people he considered his and the wider world on which his rackets fed. That pattern, protective within, exploitative without, is a common thread in many historical studies of traditional organized crime groups. In their own circles, men like Napolitano could be generous, even self-sacrificing. They lent money to fellow members in trouble, sent food to families when someone was in prison, attended weddings and funerals with conspicuous respect. But towards those outside the circle, debt-burdened gamblers, anxious shopkeepers, frightened bar owners, they applied pressure without hesitation. The pain of a stranger did not carry the same moral weight as the discomfort of a fellow friend of ours, to use the internal label for a made man. In the decades since his death, scholars and former participants alike have wrestled with how to describe people like Napolitano without either glamorizing them or flattening them into caricatures. Piston's account, for example, is careful not to portray him as a misunderstood figure secretly longing to escape his life. On the contrary, the undercover agent emphasizes that Napolitano believed in the structure and values of the Bonanno family, that he saw his role as a source of pride and identity. There is no evidence in the record of him expressing doubt about the legitimacy of organized crime as a way of life. His frustrations were with particular individuals or tactical decisions, not with the system itself. At the same time, it is difficult to ignore the generational context that fed that belief. Born in 1930, he belonged to a cohort of Italian-American men who reached adulthood at a time when many doors were still closed to them. While discrimination was easing by the 1950s and 1960s, and more Italian-Americans were entering professions once dominated by older groups, the path was uneven. For a working-class youth in Williamsburg, lacking college education or high-level connections, the choices that presented themselves could feel narrow. Factory work, manual labor, union jobs if one got lucky, or the informal economy of gambling, shylocking, and neighborhood protection. The fact that many of his contemporaries chose different paths does not erase the forces that made his eventual trajectory plausible. The early exposure to neighborhood power brokers, the tangible examples of men who commanded deference without formal titles, the stories of how friends fixed problems when official channels failed. All of this made the Bonanno world seem not just lucrative, but understandable and attainable. When Piston later described Napolitano as a true believer, he was capturing that sense of identification. The organization did not feel to him like an intrusion into his life. It was his life. The ethical questions raised by the undercover operation that ultimately destroyed him have also been part of the historical discussion. Critics, both inside and outside the legal field, have asked whether law enforcement crossed lines by allowing an agent to participate in criminal enterprises over such a long period, even if he did so under careful supervision and with measures in place to limit harm. Did the presence of Donnie Brasco encourage the Bonannos to undertake ventures they might otherwise have avoided? Did talk of using him in a planned killing create additional risk that would not have existed without the operation? Most studies suggest that the underlying dynamics, the internal Bonanno War, the expansion into Florida, the focus on gambling and loan sharking, were products of the family's own ambitions and conflicts, not of the agent's presence. The murders of the 3 rebellious captains, for example, were driven by a long-standing power struggle in which Donnie played no part. The Florida operations predated his involvement. He simply stepped into a role that would otherwise have been filled by another associate. As for the plot against Bruno Indelicato, every indication is that the Bonannos would have pursued him regardless. If anything, the FBI's decision to pull their agent out when they did prevented one additional killing. Still, the Brasco case forced law enforcement agencies to confront the uncomfortable reality that effective undercover work meant living among, and sometimes enabling, people who caused real harm. Piston dined with them, drove with them, shared jokes and confidences, all while silently recording and reporting on their activities. He developed professional relationships, even a form of personal rapport, with men like Napolitano, whom he knew his work would eventually bring down. When Napolitano was killed in retaliation, it underscored that human cost. He had never intended to help the FBI. He had not broken the law's code of cooperation. Yet he died because an operation he had unknowingly welcomed into his home shattered the illusion of security on which his world depended. For Napolitano's own family, the public record is thinner. Unlike some mob figures whose children later wrote books or gave interviews, his immediate relatives stayed largely out of view. A few small details surface here and there. Mentions of a brother, references to a woman he lived with for a time, anecdotal remarks about relatives who came to check on the house after he vanished. But there are no extensive public statements, no memoirs attempting to defend or condemn him. Their silence is part of the larger pattern in many such families, who often prefer to let notorious pasts recede into memory rather than relive them in the media spotlight. In the neighborhoods where he had once been a daily presence, the traces of his life have grown faint. The Motion Lounge eventually closed, its role as a banana command post remembered mainly by older residents and by specialists in organized crime history. Williamsburg itself transformed under waves of urban change. Factories closed, artists moved in, property values soared, long-time working-class families were pushed out by gentrification. The world of corner social clubs and tightly knit ethnic networks that had sustained the Bonanno family's street operations in the mid-20th century gave way to a very different urban landscape. Yet in another sense, his story remains stubbornly present, precisely because it has been preserved in so many layers of documentation and retelling. FBI memoranda, written in dry bureaucratic language, trace his movements and meetings. Grand jury transcripts record witnesses spelling his name and identifying him in photographs. Pistone's narrative, and later its film adaptation, dramatize his gestures and voice for a mass audience. Academic works on the American Mafia use him as a case study in mid-level leadership and internal discipline. Court opinions cite crimes plotted in his presence as evidence in racketeering cases against others. Through all these lenses, one can see how a man's life becomes history, not in the sense of being grand or heroic, but in the sense of being recorded, analyzed, and used to illuminate broader patterns. Napolitano's choices and actions help modern readers understand the appeal and the costs of organized crime in a particular time and place. His adherence to a code that ultimately justified his killing shows the internal logic of an organization that prized loyalty to itself above all else. His failure to detect an undercover agent in his midst demonstrates both the limits of traditional underworld methods and the evolution of law enforcement techniques in the late 20th century. It is tempting, in looking back, to impose a tidy moral arc, to say that a man who profited for years from the misfortunes of others got what he deserved when his own organization turned on him. But the historical record resists such simplification. It shows someone who lived consistently according to a set of values that were at once harsh and deeply held, who inflicted harm through systems that were often faceless and quietly coercive, and who, in the end, refused the one option, cooperation with authorities, that might have saved his life, because to him it was unthinkable. Whether one sees that as misguided loyalty, tragic stubbornness, or simply the inevitable outcome of a lifetime of choices, depends on the vantage point from which his story is viewed. What is clear is that the world that produced him has changed. The Bonanno family still exists in some form, as do other traditional mafia groups, but their reach and influence are diminished compared to the mid-century peak. Other criminal organizations, with different ethnic bases and structures, have taken root. New technologies have transformed both criminal enterprises and policing methods. In this altered landscape, the figure of a Brooklyn capo seated at a corner table in a dim neighborhood bar, quietly directing numbers games and shylocking operations, belongs increasingly to history. Yet the questions his life raises, about loyalty and identity, about the ways marginalized communities create their own systems of power, about the ethics of infiltration and the cost of secrecy, remain live issues. That is why, decades after a man stepped out of his house for the last time, leaving his pigeons to circle above an empty roof, historians, agents, and filmmakers still return to his story. In the spaces between the official documents and the remembered conversations, between the plain facts of his crimes and the quiet gestures of his final morning, they find a lens for examining not only the underworld he inhabited, but also the society that allowed it to flourish and then set itself to bringing it down. By the early years of the 21st century, when the last legal cases tied to the Donnie Brasco investigation were winding down, and Dominick Napolitano's remains had finally been identified, the world that had shaped his life was largely gone. The Bonanno family still existed, as did the other traditional mafia groups in New York, but they no longer enjoyed the widespread influence and insulation from scrutiny they had once taken for granted. The arc of Napolitano's life, his rise from a Brooklyn neighborhood club to a place at the heart of a powerful criminal organization, and his death at that organization's hands after an unprecedented undercover breach, had become a case study in the transformation of both organized crime and the law enforcement methods used to confront it. The Brasco operation, in which Napolitano played such a central unwitting role, left a deep imprint inside the FBI and the broader justice system. Internally, it was hailed as proof that long-term undercover work could penetrate even the most secretive criminal structures, if the agent had the patience and support to live a cover story year after year. But it also became a touchstone in debates about how far such operations should be allowed to go. Supervisors and ethicists within the Bureau examined questions that Napolitano himself could never have imagined. How to balance the intelligence value of embedding an agent against the risk that his presence might contribute, however indirectly, to ongoing harm. How to draw hard lines about what an undercover operative could and could not participate in, and when to pull an agent out even if it meant losing access to a rich stream of information. The moment when Napolitano tasked Donnie with helping to kill Bruno Indelicato became, in these discussions, a decisive example. It showed how easily the internal logic of a long-running infiltration could pull an agent toward situations the Bureau could not permit. After Brasco, formal guidelines around undercover work were tightened. Approvals for deep cover operations required higher-level authorization and more frequent review. Operational plans had to include explicit, written boundaries about the kinds of criminal activity an agent could simulate or be present around, and which acts, especially violence, would trigger immediate withdrawal or intervention. The case in which a Bonanno captain came close to sponsoring an FBI agent for formal induction into the mafia was used to drive home to new agents both the power and the perils of living another life. At the same time, the prosecutions built in part on the Brasco evidence were only the beginning of a broader legal offensive against traditional organized crime. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, federal prosecutors in New York used the RICO statute aggressively against all 5 families, targeting bosses and underbosses who had long managed to insulate themselves from lower-level arrests. Cooperative witnesses, made members who chose, unlike Napolitano, to testify, began to appear with increasing frequency. Carefully constructed family trees that had once existed only in internal FBI files were now projected in courtrooms, with jurors asked to follow lines of authority from street-level bookmakers all the way up to men whose names had once been spoken only in hushed tones. For the Bonannos, the most dramatic example of this shift came in 2003, when Joseph Massino, who had shared power with Napolitano in the late 1970s and early 1980s and later, became the family's longtime boss, chose to cooperate with federal authorities after his own conviction. Where Napolitano had walked into a basement and accepted the consequences of the code they both lived by, Massino, facing the prospect of a life sentence and the seizure of his assets, agreed to break that code. He sat with prosecutors and described the inner workings of the family he had led, wearing a concealed recording device to capture his successors speaking freely. Among the many crimes he admitted responsibility for was the decision that sealed Napolitano's fate. In this sense, the two men's stories form a stark contrast within the same organizational history. Napolitano represented a generation that accepted the rules of Cosa Nostra as immutable. Once you were in, you never cooperated with law enforcement, no matter the cost. Massino's decision to testify signaled that, by the turn of the century, Those rules were losing their grip, even on men who had once enforced them ruthlessly. It was an irony not lost on observers that the code for which Napolitano died, refusing even to consider talking to authorities when he realized his own organization had marked him, was later abandoned by the man who had helped order his death. As prosecutors and agents worked through the final waves of mafia cases, the Brasco operation and Napolitano's role in it also began to filter into academic and popular analysis. Criminologists used the case to illustrate the structure of mid-level mafia leadership. The way a capo like Napolitano mediated between the street and the upper hierarchy, translating broad strategic decisions into specific instructions about gambling, lending, and discipline. They examined the internal justice of the mafia, its quick, final decisions about who had failed and what penalty they should pay, as a form of extralegal governance, parallel to but in constant tension with official law. Historians of Italian-American life saw in his trajectory a more specific story about assimilation and identity. In their accounts, his life reflected how some second-generation immigrants, growing up in insular neighborhoods where state institutions were mistrusted or absent, could find in organized crime a perverse form of belonging and advancement. They contrasted his path with that of other Italian Americans of his generation, who entered politics, unions, and professional careers, often battling against the very stereotypes that the existence of mafia figures reinforced. In this view, Napolitano's life sits at the intersection of ethnicity, class, and opportunity, shaped as much by social conditions as by individual temperament. The popular imagination, however, encountered him primarily through the lens of the Donnie Brasco narrative. When the film adaptation was released in 1997, audiences saw a fictionalized version of Dominick, Sonny Black, Napolitano on screen, renamed but heavily based on the historical figure, portrayed as a stern yet strangely sympathetic mentor to the undercover agent. The movie, while drawing on the factual backbone of Pistone's memoir, inevitably compressed events and heightened emotional beats for dramatic effect. It suggested moments of doubt and introspection that do not appear in the documentary record, portraying the capo as a man who, at times, seemed to feel trapped by the very life he had spent decades defending. For historians, this created both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, the film and book brought a remarkable real case to public attention, sparking interest in the nuances of undercover work, mafia structure, and the lived reality of organized crime beyond headlines. On the other hand, the cinematic tendency to humanize central characters risked softening the perception of what those characters actually did. Napolitano's calm demeanor and his apparent personal kindness to those he considered his could, in the wrong light, overshadow the concrete harm generated by the rackets he ran. The families ruined by unpayable debts, the gamblers who lost savings in games the house always tilted in its favor, the small businesses squeezed for cash month after month. Writers and documentarians who returned to the subject in later years often tried to thread this needle, presenting Napolitano as a fully realized person without obscuring the damage his choices inflicted. They pointed out that the very qualities that made him, in Pistone's eyes, a compelling figure, discipline, loyalty, steadiness, were also what allowed him to function effectively within a criminal system. He rarely raised his voice because he did not need to. His authority, backed by the family's reputation, was enough. He did not have to threaten borrowers directly. The knowledge of who he was and whom he answered to did much of the work for him. The question of harm extends beyond immediate victims. In neighborhoods like the Williamsburg of Napolitano's prime, the presence of a strong mafia crew could distort local economies and social relations. Some businesses thrived under protection from vandalism or competing criminal groups, but only at the price of ongoing tribute and eventual dependence. Some residents saw mob figures as helpful intermediaries with landlords or city agencies. But this often deepened the perception that solutions to local problems had to come from unofficial power brokers rather than from accountable public institutions. In subtle ways, the shadow of a man like Napolitano could reinforce a sense of fatalism, that certain forms of corruption and coercion were simply part of how the world worked. As the decades passed, that shadow receded, not because history forgot him, but because the urban fabric that had sustained his way of life changed. The Italian-American communities that had once dominated large sections of Brooklyn dispersed, their children and grandchildren moving to suburbs or other states. New immigrant groups arrived, bringing their own networks and challenges. Old social clubs closed or turned into restaurants and boutiques. Where the Motion Lounge once served as a command post for a banana crew, later tenants welcomed a different clientele altogether, often unaware of the building's past role in organized crime. For New York City more broadly, the decline of traditional mafia power, accelerated by cases like Brasco, intersected with other large forces. Deindustrialization, the crack epidemic, rising and then falling crime rates, gentrification. Organized crime did not disappear, it evolved. Other groups, some ethnically based, some more fluid, took over certain roles: drug distribution, fraud schemes, human trafficking. The old mafia families, including the Bananos, attempted to adapt, sometimes forming alliances with newer organizations, sometimes retreating to lower-profile operations. But the image of the neighborhood capo, easily visible to anyone who knew where to look, lost much of its relevance. Within law enforcement culture, however, Napolitano's story retained a clear place. At FBI and police academies, the Brasco operation was dissected both as a triumph of investigative innovation and as a warning about the stakes involved. Instructors used transcripts of conversations with him to demonstrate how a skilled undercover agent could gain the confidence of hardened criminals without resorting to flamboyance or overt manipulation. They also used the eventual fallout, his murder at the hands of his own associates, to underline the human cost of such work, not just for agents but for the people they targeted. However lawful and necessary the operations were deemed, they reshaped lives in permanent ways. In the end, assessing Dominick Napolitano's legacy means holding multiple truths at once. He was, by the evidence, a loyal servant and mid-level architect of an organization that enriched itself through exploitation and systematic lawbreaking. He devoted his adult life to enforcing and benefiting from a code that placed the family's interests above individual rights, above the safety of communities, and above the authority of democratic institutions. He oversaw and profited from enterprises that caused real suffering, even if that suffering did not always take the dramatic form that makes headlines. At the same time, he was not a caricature of random cruelty. The records and recollections show a man shaped by a specific time, place, and culture, who found in the Bonanno family a sense of belonging and purpose that the broader society of his youth did not seem to offer him. He cultivated loyalty among his crew, honored his own superiors' claims to leadership, and when the code he had embraced demanded his life as payment for a failure, he accepted that judgment rather than abandon that code at the last moment. These choices do not absolve him. They do, however, help explain why he made them. For those living now, perhaps the most useful way to view his life is not through the lens of nostalgia or easy moralizing, but as a reminder of how powerful closed systems of belief and obligation can be. In the world of Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano, the mafia's rules felt more real, more immediate than the abstractions of the law. The promises and threats that flowed through the Motion Lounge carried more weight than court summonses or distant elections. Only when an undercover agent sat quietly at his table, taking it all in, did the larger society's institutions begin to close that gap. From a Brooklyn tenement in 1930 to a hidden grave uncovered in 2002, his story tracks the rise and partial unmaking of a particular American underworld. It shows how a boy from an immigrant neighborhood can become, over time, both a maker and a casualty of a criminal order that he believes to be unshakable. And it underscores a final, enduring lesson, that even the most tightly guarded worlds are vulnerable to being seen, understood, and eventually brought to account.